Before we get started, if you're new here, welcome to Velvet Echoes. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below letting us know what city you're watching from. We love seeing where our audience is tuning in from across Canada and around the world. He handed her the eviction notice at her own retirement dinner. Not quietly, not privately, the way a person does something they're at least ashamed of. He did it in front of 43 people, her colleagues, her students, her oldest friends, slid the envelope across the white tablecloth while the speeches were still going, while someone was mid-sentence talking about what a brilliant woman she was, and said, loud enough for the table to hear, "You should know about this before you make any more plans." Her name was Vivienne Croft. She was 51. She had spent 26 years building the cardiovascular research division at St. Ambrose Medical Center in Ottawa, had turned it from a 3-person unit running out of a converted storage room into one of the most cited clinical research departments in the country, and she was, by any reasonable measure, the reason that hospital had the reputation it did. The man who handed her the envelope was her husband of 19 years. His name was Lawrence. She didn't open it at the table. She folded her hands over it, smiled at the woman still giving the speech, and said nothing. That was the thing about Vivienne that most people never quite understood. She was not the kind of woman who collapsed in public. She had learned, very early, that stillness was its own kind of power. She would read it later. And when she did, she would understand exactly what Lawrence had done, how long he had been planning it, and what it was going to cost him. But that was later. Let me take you back. Vivienne had grown up in Sudbury, the eldest daughter of a nurse and a high school science teacher who had both worked double shifts their entire lives and still never quite managed to own anything outright. She understood scarcity the way people who've lived it do, not as an abstract concept, but as a specific texture, the weight of turning off lights in rooms you've just left, the particular sound of a parent doing math in their head while standing in a grocery store aisle. She had gotten into medicine on a full scholarship, had deferred twice while she worked to help her younger sister finish high school, had arrived at her first year of medical school at 24, 2 years older than most of her classmates, with a single suitcase and a certainty that she was not going to waste this. She met Lawrence Croft in her second year. He was in law. He was handsome in the way that men who've never been told no are handsome. Easy in his skin, confident with a kind of carelessness that looked like charm, until you'd seen enough of it to know the difference. She was 26 and had never had time to fall in love with anyone, so way married when she finished her residency. She was 32. He was already a partner at a mid-size firm in Ottawa, and the plan, their plan, the one they talked about over dinner, the one that felt real, was that she'd finish her fellowship, he'd build his practice, and somewhere in the middle they'd build a life that felt like what they'd both been working toward. What Vivienne did not know, and would not know for years, was that Lawrence had been living a version of that life with someone else since almost the beginning. She didn't find out about the affair the way people usually do. A text message left open, a receipt that didn't make sense, a friend who couldn't keep a secret. She found out because Lawrence told her, but not in the way that looks like honesty. He told her because he'd already decided to leave, and telling her was simply the most efficient path to what he wanted next. It was a Tuesday evening in October. She had just come home from a 14-hour day and a grant renewal. There was a conference paper due, restructured entirely, because the federal criteria had changed without warning. She had eaten a granola bar at noon. She was by any clinical definition running on nothing. He was sitting at the kitchen table when she came in, and she knew before he said a word, not because of anything dramatic. No bags by the door, no particular expression. She knew because he was home at 7, which he almost never was, and he was sitting still, which he almost never did. Lawrence was a man in motion. When he stopped, it meant something. He told her he'd been with someone else for the better part of a decade. He told her he was sorry it had gone on this long. He told her he thought she deserved to know the truth, which was the cruelest possible way to frame it, as if his timing was a gift, as if she should be grateful. Then he told her about the house. The house they lived in. The one she had assumed was jointly owned. The one she had poured money into for 17 years. The renovations, the new roof, the kitchens that she had designed down to the last cabinet pull, was in fact held in a trust that Lawrence had structured years ago through his firm. She was not on the title. She had never been on the title. He had very quietly and very legally made certain of that. The eviction notice, delivered at her retirement dinner, was the final step. He had waited until the exact moment that she no longer had her position at the hospital, her office, her institutional address, to hand her a document that told her she also no longer had her home. He had planned it to land at the moment he believed she had the least leverage. He was wrong about that. But he wouldn't know it for a while yet. She stayed in a hotel for the first 3 nights, not because she couldn't afford something better, but because she needed time to think, and she had always thought more clearly in anonymous spaces. Places with no accumulated weight of memory in the walls. She didn't call her sister. She didn't call any of the colleagues who'd been at the dinner. She ordered room service, opened her laptop, and spent those first 3 evenings reading documents, the trust structure, the property records, every financial filing she could access, and making lists. Vivienne Croft was a scientist by training and a researcher by vocation. What that meant, in practical terms, was that she did not react to data. She organized it. What she found as she organized it was this: Lawrence had been thorough. He had covered the house, the joint accounts, the mortgage history in a way that would take a long time and a significant amount of money to challenge. He had clearly been advised, well, possibly for years. Every document was airtight, but there was something Lawrence had forgotten, or perhaps had never known, about the nature of what Vivienne actually. For the past 6 years, alongside her clinical work, she had been developing a research protocol in partnership with 2 colleagues, a biostatistician named Dr. Jonah Fairweather and a molecular biologist named Dr. Ruth O'Cake, that had produced 18 months earlier a provisional patent application. The application covered a diagnostic methodology for early-stage cardiac arrhythmia detection using a machine learning model trained on longitudinal patient data. It was, in the language of the industry, a significant breakthrough. It was also, in the language of intellectual property law, entirely hers. Lawrence had never asked about her work. Not once in 19 years had he asked the specific question that might have told him what she was sitting on. He had always thought of her research as prestigious, as the kind of thing that looked good on a biography, as the reason she kept such inconvenient hours. He had never thought of it as an asset. That was a mistake that was going to cost him in ways he could not yet calculate. The call came on a Wednesday morning, 4 weeks after the retirement dinner. Vivienne was in a rented apartment in the Glebe. A nice one. Not because she needed comfort, but because she needed quiet when her phone rang with a Toronto area code she didn't recognize. She let it go to voicemail, listened to it, and then sat for a moment before calling back. What? The voice on the other end belonged to a man named Sterling Hale, the head of life sciences acquisitions at a private equity group called Meridian Capital Partners. He explained, been following the patent application with significant interest. His firm had a particular focus on cardiovascular diagnostics. He was calling to ask whether Dr. Croft would be willing to have a conversation. She said she would think about it. She called Jonah first, then Ruth. Both of them had been through the same provisional filing process. Both of them had agreed in the original partnership document they'd drawn up 3 years earlier to a structure that gave Vivienne the controlling interest in any commercialization of the methodology, 60%, with the remaining 40% split between them, in exchange for her having shouldered the majority of the administrative and grant-writing burden in the early years. It had seemed at the time like a fair accounting of who had done what. It still was. She called Sterling Hale back the following morning. She told him she was willing to have the conversation, but that she would be bringing her own mind below, which she would not begin negotiations. He asked what the number was. She told him. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Gone? Not a long one. Sterling Hale was not the kind of man who let silences run, but long enough to be meaningful. "That's a serious number," he said. "It's a serious methodology," she said. The negotiations took 4 months. Vivienne showed up to every meeting the same way she had always shown up to grant panels and hospital board presentations, prepared past the point of certainty. Calm, in the way that people are calm when they're not performing calm, but actually feel it, because they have done the work and they know it. The Meridian team was good. Sterling Hale was sharp, and the lawyers he'd brought in were thorough in the way that made it side blinking. First, they tested the methodology, challenged the data, brought in 2 independent reviewers to assess the patent's defensibility, and came back each time with a number lower than the one they'd been given. Vivienne did not blink. There was a meeting in February, the 6th or 7th, she had lost count, where the lead counsel on Meridian's side said something she was apparently not supposed to hear because he said it pisons. Between sessions, he said to someone on his team, "She's not going to move. I don't know what she's playing, but she's not going to move." He was not wrong. In the 3rd week of March, Meridian Capital Partners made a final offer. Vivienne's 60% of the licensing and commercialization rights for the diagnostic methodology, structured as a combination of upfront payment and tiered royalties over a 15-year period, came to a figure that her lawyer, when she read it, had to read twice: $920 million over the life of the agreement. Vivienne's share. Jonah cried on the phone. Ruth went entirely silent for almost a full minute before she said, "Vivienne, Vivienne, are you there?" And Vivienne said yes. She was there. She was always there, and she was sorry she hadn't called sooner. She did not make a statement. She did not post anything. She did not call a single person who had been at the retirement dinner to tell them what had happened. The only call she made, the one she had been thinking about since that hotel room in October, was to a family law attorney in Ottawa named Caroline Webb, who had been recommended by a colleague and who had, over the previous 4 months, been quietly building a case that had nothing to do with the house because Lawrence, in his certainty that he structured everything correctly, had made one error. A small one, the kind that looks like nothing until it looks like everything. The trust that held the house had been established using funds from a joint account that predated the trust by 11 months. During those 11 months, Vivienne had made 2 significant deposits into that account from a research grant paid directly to her, grants she had applied for, received and administered, grants that her name alone was on. She had contributed, in that 11-month window, just over $240,000. That was, by any reasonable definition, hers. Lawrence had built his structure on a foundation that included her money, and he had never told her that was what he was doing with it. That, Caroline Webb explained, was fraud. Not the complicated kind. The straightforward kind. The hearing was not dramatic. Vivienne had expected something that looked more like justice. A room with a weight to it. A moment of visible reckoning. What she got instead was a Tuesday morning in a civil courtroom with beige walls and fluorescent lighting, and a judge who had clearly seen versions of this story before and was not especially surprised by it. Lawrence sat across from her, with 2 lawyers she didn't recognize. He had not looked at her directly when she came in. He looked at the table, at the window, at the space slightly to the left of. She noticed he was wearing the blue suit she had bought him for a firm dinner 7 years ago. She wasn't sure if that was intentional. She sat with Caroline and let the process be what it was. The outcome came 6 weeks later. The trust was unwound. The house was ordered to be sold with the proceeds, after accounting for the contribution Vivienne had made, divided in a way that left Lawrence with significantly less than he had planned and combined with what she'd received from Meridian, and Vivienne with a figure that meant she would never again need to think about the particular mathematics of turning off lights in rooms she'd just left. She did not attend the house sale. She did not want to watch strangers walk through the rooms she had lived in. She let Caroline handle it, signed the documents when they came, and moved on. She bought a house in the Glebe 3 streets from the apartment she'd rented. It was smaller than what she'd had, but the light in the afternoon was extraordinary. It came through the west-facing windows, and sat on the kitchen floor in long, warm rectangles that shifted as the day moved. And she had always been someone who cared more about light than square footage. She set up a proper office on the second floor. She had agreed, as part of the Meridian deal, to serve as a scientific advisor for the first 3 years of the methodology's commercialization, which gave her work without giving her the administrative weight she had spent 26 years carrying. She found she was good at it. It turned out that what she loved had never been the institution. It had been the problem, the question at the center of the work, the particular of a data set that didn't quite behave the way the existing models predicted. She still had that. That had never been Lawrence's to take. Jonah and Ruth flew out, and they sat in her kitchen on a Saturday afternoon and ate takeout from the place around the corner and talked for 4 hours about what had happened and what was going to happen and what it felt like to be at this particular point in their lives, standing somewhere entirely different from where they'd expected. Jonah said at one point that he kept waiting for it to feel real. Ruth said she'd stopped waiting and started spending instead, which made all three of them laugh in the specific way that people laugh when something has been genuinely terrible and is, finally, genuinely over. She ran into Lawrence once. It was the following November, outside a coffee shop near the law courts. She was coming out, and there was a moment where they both stopped and neither of them said anything. He looked like a person who had learned something he hadn't wanted to know. Not ruined, not broken, nothing like that. Just smaller. The way people get smaller when the version of themselves they'd been performing stops being something they can maintain. She said good morning. She meant it. He said good morning back. And then he went inside, and she walked to her car, and that was all. She sat in the parking lot for a few minutes before starting the engine. Not because she was upset, or because she was replaying anything. She sat because sometimes, when things are genuinely finished, there's a moment of stillness before you drive away, and it deserves to be what it is. Not dramatized, not narrated. Just a quiet Tuesday in November with the kind of flat gray sky that Ottawa does in the fall, and the particular feeling of having arrived somewhere you had to walk the whole distance to reach. She started the engine. She drove. If this story stayed with you, hit the like button. It genuinely helps more people find these stories. And if you're new to Velvet Echoes, subscribe and drop a comment with your city. We'd love to know where you're watching from.